In a government file in Tallahassee, Florida, there's a letter dated November 1st, 1943. It was written by a former state senator named W.T. Cash to the state geologist, a man named Herman Gunter. The letter asks a simple question. What was actually burning in the swamp south of the city for at least 20 years in a spot no one could ever quite find twice? That letter is real. It sits in the Florida State Archives today, one piece of a paper trail that runs back more than a century. Newspapers, government letters, sworn witness accounts, search party logs, all of it pointing at the same patch of wilderness southeast of Tallahassee, and all of it circling a phenomenon the state itself never officially explained. Here's the physical evidence that survives. In the 1920s, two men named James Kirkland and Judge A.L. Porter were hunting in that swamp when they found a hole about the size of a dishpan. It went straight down into the earth, and the rock around its mouth looked burned. Nearby, they found a chain of limestone boulders, one of them reportedly over 100 feet across, with its edges rounded off, as if something had melted them. Florida has no volcanoes. It sits in the middle of a tectonic plate. Nowhere near a fault line or a magma chamber, there's no mechanism in this state for lava. And yet somebody found a hole that looked burned, next to rock that looked melted, in a swamp that for 100 years had been producing smoke, flame, and a noise loud enough to wake households 10 miles away. Locals called it the Wakula volcano. This episode is the case file. What was actually there? What people tried and failed to prove? What the record eliminates? And what's still, as of today, an open question sitting in a box in a state archive. The Florida Panhandle has no shortage of strange geography. Islands that migrate down the coast, sinkholes that open without warning under front yards, rivers that vanish underground and resurface miles away. What sets this case apart from all of it's the paper. Most regional oddities get a handful of local stories, and maybe a newspaper clipping. This one got a national wire story in 1880. A state representative's testimony, a formal letter from a former senator to the state's chief geologist, and roughly a dozen organized search expeditions spread across more than 80 years. That combination, a phenomenon this well documented and still this unresolved, is what makes it stand out. Not the scariest story in the Panhandle. The best paper trail attached to an ending nobody ever actually confirmed. Start with where this is, because the geography matters more than the legend. The activity was reported from a stretch of swamp straddling the line between Wakula County and Jefferson County, in a section known as the Gum Swamp, inside what's now the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, and closer still to a larger wetland called the Wassissa Swamp. This is flat, low, forested wetland country. Pine flatwoods giving way to cypress and gum trees standing in black water. Underneath, almost all of it's limestone, the same porous, cavity-riddled rock that defines this whole stretch of the Florida Panhandle. That detail is going to matter later. For now, just picture the terrain. No roads, no trails that lasted. A landscape that, before modern drainage and logging, could swallow a search party for a week and not give up its center. This was never empty ground either, and that matters. The nearby town of St. Mark's, the launch point for the first organized search in 1875, sits on land the Spanish fortified in the 1700s, building a fort called San Marcos de Apalache on a site the Apalache and other indigenous nations had already been using for generations before any European ship reached this coast. The swamp behind that fort carries that same depth of human presence. Every search party in this case file was walking into a landscape with its own long, layered history, one this investigation treats with the same care as the physical evidence. Anyone can walk into a smaller version of this terrain today, a few miles closer to the city. The Leon Sinks geological area, just south of Tallahassee off U.S. Highway 319, sits on what geologists call the Woodville Karst Plain. Its trails pass a series of open sinkholes and a creek called Fisher Creek, sometimes nicknamed the Lost Stream, that runs for about a mile and then vanishes straight down into a hole in the limestone. It's a public park, and it's the same kind of ground, geologically, as the swamp this case is built around. Rainwater has been dissolving this limestone for so long that the whole region is closer to a block of Swiss cheese than solid bedrock. That's the printed geological description of the plain itself, and it sets up everything that follows. From a rise on the outskirts of Tallahassee, looking south, people watched smoke rise from that direction for decades. The written record gets solid starting in the 1860s, when regional newspapers began treating it as a known local fact. But people in the area claimed the sightings went back much further, into the early 1800s and, by some tellings, before that. The 1860s material is where the paper trail becomes verifiable, so that's where this case file begins in earnest. By 1880, the story had gone from regional curiosity to a genuine news event. On June 12th of that year, the Tallahassee Patriot ran a detailed report on the phenomenon. It was significant enough that the New York Times reprinted the story 8 days later, on June 20th. A wilderness smoke column in the Florida Panhandle was, for a few weeks, national news. The descriptions in these accounts are consistent enough to take seriously. Witnesses described a column of black smoke, sometimes reported as white, rising well above the tree line, occasionally with a greenish or whitish haze around its base. At night, some reports mention a faint glow visible from a distance, consistent with a smoldering fire rather than an open blaze. And repeatedly, across different witnesses in different years, people describe a deep rumbling sound, strong enough that families near the swamp's edge said it felt and sounded like an earthquake. The novelist Maurice Thompson, writing about it at the time, called it the greatest physical phenomenon in Florida. That's a strong claim from someone with no financial or political reason to inflate it. And the witness list isn't limited to anonymous settlers. W.T. Cash, the same man who wrote that 1943 letter to the state geologist, said his own mother witnessed the smoke and flame near the community of Waukena. In separate sightings recorded around 1870 and again in 1896. A sitting Florida state representative from Taylor County, W.P. Strickland, reported seeing it as well, around 1899. This story had reached all the way to the state legislature. Now, the folklore. Every unexplained fire in a remote swamp accumulates theories, and this one accumulated a full set. During the Civil War years, some suspected the smoke was a signal, either from Confederate deserters hiding in the swamp or from someone communicating with Union blockade ships off the coast. Others blamed moonshine stills, reasoning that illegal distillers would want a location this hard to reach. Some blamed a hermit living deep in the wetland. Some blamed pirates or smugglers storing and burning contraband. Local storytelling produced a figure called the Old Man of the Swamp, and in 1922, a writer named Renette Hunt published an epic poem titled Osola, The Legend of the Mysterious Smoke of Wakulla, which wrapped the whole phenomenon in a Native American origin myth involving a chief. None of these survive contact with the actual documented behavior of the smoke. A still or a hermit's fire doesn't produce a rumble that shakes ground 10 miles away. A signal fire, run continuously for decades in the same general area, would have been found by any of the dozen expeditions that went looking, because a signal fire needs a person tending it, and people leave trails, camps, supply lines. Nobody found any of that. The poem is a myth, useful as folklore, and nothing more. This case file sets all of it aside, not because it's disrespectful to the communities who told these stories, but because none of it survives basic scrutiny against the documented facts. The smoke was real. The stories built to explain it, mostly, filled a gap with the most dramatic available answer instead of testing the evidence. There was one attempt at a mundane explanation that at least tried to use evidence, and it's worth examining because it collapsed so cleanly. In November of 1883, the New Orleans Daily Picayune ran a story with the headline, quote, "A Florida Mystery Solved," end quote. Their explanation was that a newly built steam-powered cotton gin or sawmill in the area accounted for the smoke. It's a reasonable guess on its face. Steam mills do produce smoke and noise, but the timeline destroys it. Reports of this exact phenomenon in this exact location predate any documented mill there by years, and continued for years after that 1883 article ran. A single mill can't explain a smoke column that newspapers were describing in 1880, 3 years earlier, and that witnesses were still reporting well into the 1890s. The Picayune's own headline turned out to be premature by more than a decade. So the folklore fails, and the one attempted rational explanation fails on its own timeline. What's left is the physical search record, and it's a rough one. The first serious expedition on record left from the coastal town of St. Mark's in 1875. That party found a large rock formation and, for a while, believed they had found the crater. They hadn't. It was simply an unusual outcrop, the kind that this limestone terrain produces in several places. The following year, in 1876, a reporter from the New York Herald Tribune organized an expedition into the swamp. It took 3 days of cutting through dense wetland. Partway through, the party's guide fell from a tree he had climbed to get a bearing on the smoke, and the group turned back. The reporter himself died of fever not long after returning to Tallahassee, almost certainly from disease picked up in the swamp itself rather than anything supernatural. But it's a real, documented cost attached to this search, and it set the tone for how dangerous this terrain actually was to work in. In 1891, a man named J.H. Staley, working with a writer named Charles Ledyard Norton, made 2 attempts. He nearly died on the first one. On the second, his party spent more than 2 weeks hacking through dense growth, dealing with snakes and thick clouds of mosquitoes, in country that had no trails and no reliable water crossings. Then in the 1920s came the discovery that actually produced physical evidence. Kirkland and Judge Porter, hunting in the area, found that dishpan-sized hole with burned-looking rock around it, next to the chain of limestone boulders, with their rounded, heat-worn edges. Porter's own theory, recorded at the time, was that natural gas had found its way to the surface through a crack in the limestone and been set alight by lightning or by a passing wildfire. It was the first theory offered by someone who had actually stood at the site and looked at the hole, rather than someone speculating from Tallahassee. In the early 1930s, William Wyatt and a partner named Fred Wimpy drove out in a Model T Ford with a machete, a hand axe, and a flashlight, planning a one-day trip that stretched into a full weekend of cutting through the swamp. They found sinkholes near rock piles that also showed apparent heat damage. Wyatt's theory built directly on what Porter had proposed a decade earlier. Limestone country like this is full of underground cavities, and those cavities accumulate decades of fallen branches, leaves, and other organic debris. Wyatt's argument was that a mass of this material, packed into an underground limestone chamber, had been ignited, likely by lightning, and had then burned the way a coal seam fire burns in Pennsylvania. Slowly, for years. Mostly out of sight, with only smoke and heat escaping through cracks and sinkholes to the surface. By 1943, when Cash wrote his letter to the state geologist, this had become the leading working theory among the people who had actually spent time in the swamp. Cash's own version of it was specific. He believed a hillock of dense peat had caught fire during one of the controlled or accidental burn-offs that regularly swept through these wetlands during dry seasons, and that it had then smoldered underground for years inside the same kind of limestone voids Wyatt had described. Here's where the geology stops being background scenery and becomes the actual mechanism. This part of the Florida Panhandle sits on top of some of the most extensively hollowed-out limestone in the country. A few miles from the Wasissa Swamp is Wakula Springs, one of the largest and deepest freshwater springs on Earth. Divers have mapped more than 45 miles of connected underwater cave passage running out from that spring, a project that has taken teams of professional cave divers, including some of the most accomplished in the world, decades to survey, at real risk to their lives. That system wasn't built by magic. It's what happens when groundwater dissolves limestone over hundreds of thousands of years, leaving behind a landscape honeycombed with tunnels the way the Leon Sinks Trail already showed on a smaller scale. Divers connected that Wakula system to the sinkholes at Leon Sinks in 2007, forming what surveyors now call the Wakula-Leon Sinks Cave System, one of the longest underwater caves in the country. The Wasissa Swamp sits in the same broad karst province, on the same limestone shelf. It isn't physically connected to the Wakula Springs cave system, and nothing here claims that it is. But the two sites prove the same underlying point using different evidence. This region's underground geology is documented repeatedly, independently, and in extraordinary detail, as riddled with voids, chambers, and cavities capable of trapping organic material and capable of letting smoke and gas travel and vent to the surface through unpredictable, shifting cracks far from wherever the burning actually started. A fire under a swamp like this wouldn't necessarily surface where you would expect it to. It could smolder in one chamber and vent through a sinkhole a considerable distance away, which is exactly consistent with why every search party found smoke, rumbling, and burned rock, but never a single, obvious, continuously burning crater. There's also a modern measured baseline for how this kind of fire behaves, and it removes the need for anything exotic. Florida fire agencies today still fight what they call muck fires, ignitions in the same kind of ancient, carbon-dense organic soil that fills these wetland basins. Documented cases show these fires burrowing 20 to 50 feet underground once they take hold, and smoldering there for weeks, sometimes months, largely immune to surface rain because the burning material sits so far beneath it. All they require to start is a hard drought, a deep bed of dried peat, and a spark, and lightning striking a parched swamp fits that description exactly. This is a known, currently monitored category of Florida wildfire. The 19th century swamp fire this case is built around didn't need to be anything the state hasn't already cataloged in its own modern fire records. It only needed to be bigger, older, and left alone in country nobody could reach. That single fact, that the geology of this exact region is documented to be extraordinarily cavity-rich, is what elevates the peat and limestone cavity fire theory above folklore. It's a mechanism that matches known local geology, known Florida wetland fire behavior, and every physical trace anyone ever actually found at the site. Now for the piece of the record that connects the fire to its ending. On August 31st, 1886, an earthquake estimated at magnitude 7 struck near Charleston, South Carolina. It was one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded in the eastern United States, and it was felt strongly across much of Florida, hundreds of miles from its epicenter. According to multiple later accounts gathered from people who had witnessed the swamp phenomenon for years, the smoke and flames stopped not long after that earthquake. A researcher named Wilfred Neal, writing later for Florida Wildlife magazine, connected these two facts directly. His theory was that the Charleston earthquake's shaking, transmitted through hundreds of miles of the same porous limestone that had been hosting the underground fire, was enough to trigger a collapse. If the fire had hollowed out or weakened the roof of its own limestone chamber over 20 or more years of burning, a strong enough shock could have brought that chamber down on top of itself, burying and smothering the fire in one event. It's a clean, mechanically plausible explanation. It also means the swamp fire may not have been extinguished by rain, by exhausting its fuel, or by anything anyone did. It may have been buried alive by an earthquake that happened 500 miles away. The search didn't stop when the smoke did. If anything, The mystery of where exactly this had all been happening only deepened, because now there was no active smoke column to navigate by. In 1956, the Tallahassee Democrat sponsored an expedition led by a reporter named Arthur Kennedy, and around the same time, Kirkland, one of the original 1920s discoverers, led a group of explorer scouts from Post 100 back into the swamp to try to relocate what he and Porter had found decades earlier. They found the chain of rocks again. They didn't find the burned hole or any fissure. Along the way, they logged a rattlesnake, a 5.5-foot snake of another species, and an alligator nest holding roughly 40 eggs. A reminder of exactly what kind of terrain this search has always required walking into. Interest didn't end there. A photograph from 1964 shows Wyatt, by then an old man, still pointing toward the general direction of the site he had once explored. A 1974 Tallahassee Democrat article mentions small groups still claiming to have located a crater. In 1997, a team describing themselves as investigators of unexplained phenomena searched the area again and found a high point scattered with limestone rocks, consistent with earlier reports, but again, no crater and no fissure. 2 more pieces of the geological record are worth putting into the file because they get used, incorrectly, to argue this actually was volcanic. In 1949, University of Florida researchers involved in oil exploration drilling found material of volcanic origin at a depth of roughly 7,500 feet underground. A 1954 Tampa Tribune article reported a similar find by an oil drilling crew at a comparable depth. Both of these are real, and both get cited by people who want the Wakulla volcano to be literally a volcano. It doesn't hold up. That volcanic material sits more than 7,000 feet down, sealed under millions of years of subsequent limestone, sand, and clay deposition. It's geologically real, evidence that this region experienced volcanic activity tens of millions of years in the past, back when the geography of the continent looked nothing like it does now. But it isn't connected to the surface by any known channel, and Florida's modern geology, sitting on a stable, passive tectonic margin far from any plate boundary, provides no mechanism for that ancient buried material to erupt, seep, or otherwise reach a swamp near the surface in the 1800s. The Florida Geological Survey has been consistent on this point for decades. There's no active volcanism anywhere in the state. The rock formations at the suspected site, when examined, were identified as heavily weathered, silicified Suwannee limestone, a rock type well known throughout this part of the Panhandle, not volcanic stone. This is one of the clearer eliminations in the whole case. It closes the most dramatic possible answer, the one implied by the nickname itself, using nothing but confirmed regional geology. So here's where the evidence actually lands, sorted the way any case file should be sorted, evidence from folklore, verified by the documentary record. A consistent multi-decade run of newspaper reports, private letters, and named eyewitness accounts from the 1860s through at least the 1890s, describing smoke, occasional flame, and ground-shaking rumbles from one general area of swamp straddling Wakulla and Jefferson counties. A hole and a field of heat-marked limestone found at the presumed site in the 1920s. A documented pattern of failed and partially successful expeditions across more than 80 years, cutting across multiple generations of searchers who took the phenomenon seriously enough to risk their safety over it. A confirmed magnitude 7 earthquake in 1886 that multiple accounts place at the same time the smoke stopped. Confirmed regional geology showing this part of the Panhandle sits on deeply cavity-riddled limestone, capable of hosting exactly this kind of slow, hidden, underground fire. Eliminated as folklore. A true volcano, ruled out by the state's own geological surveys, and the total absence of any surface-connected magma source. Pirates, smugglers, hermits, deserters signaling ships, and a mythological chief, none of which explain a rumble felt for miles or 20-plus years of unattended, continuous activity in terrain nobody could permanently occupy. The 1883 steam mill claim, contradicted by its own timeline. Unresolved. And still sitting open in the file. The exact coordinates of the original burn were never conclusively fixed on a map. Every expedition that found rocks in a hole was working from memory, compass bearings, and secondhand directions from earlier searchers in terrain that floods, grows over, and erodes. Nobody in the historical record brought in a geologist to formally examine the reportedly melted rock under controlled conditions, so whether that rounding was actual heat damage or simply ordinary limestone dissolution, the kind karst terrain produces on its own over centuries, was never scientifically settled. No drill core has ever been taken from the suspected site. No academic institution currently treats this as an active research question. The file is, quite literally, closed by neglect, rather than by proof. That's the honest shape of this case. The mechanism is understood in outline. A peat or organic debris fire, likely started by lightning during a dry season burn-off, took hold inside a limestone cavity system in a stretch of swamp south of Tallahassee, sometime before the 1860s. It burned slowly and mostly out of sight for at least 2 decades, venting smoke, occasional flame, and a deep rumble through sinkholes and cracks that didn't necessarily sit directly above the fire itself, which is why no search party ever found one clean, obvious crater. It most likely met its end when the 1886 Charleston earthquake, felt across the state, triggered a collapse in the weakened chamber roof and buried the fire under its own ceiling. What remains open isn't the broad question of what kind of thing this was. It's the specific one, exactly where, down to a defensible set of coordinates on a modern map, this happened, and whether the same conditions exist anywhere else under this same stretch of cavity-riddled Panhandle limestone right now, quietly, with no smoke yet reaching the surface to give it away. If you know the Wasissa Swamp or the Gum Swamp section of the St. Mark's Refuge, or you have hiked through that stretch of Jefferson and Wakulla County wetland yourself, put what you have seen in the comments. Hit like if you want more case files like this one, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Somebody watching this may be standing closer to an answer than any of the search parties from 1875, 1920, or 1956 ever got.